I closed out 2020's Game of the Year video with the hope that 2021 would be a little brighter for us all, and that didn't age really well in retrospect, did it? I mean, 2020 was rough for sure, but 2021 wasn't that much better, right? And on top of that, the video game market only now seems to be feeling the effects of the pandemic, with delays pushing a lot of big releases not only out of 2020, but out of last year as well. Between that and my own personal work-life balance being thrown into disarray this year, I found compiling a list of Game of the Year contenders surprisingly difficult. No kidding, I was playing through some of the games in this video right up until New Year's Eve, just to make sure I wasn't settling for titles that may well be great, but didn't sit right with me as potential highlights of the year. But even though this might have been the hardest Game of the Year list I've ever put together, I'd be lying if I said there weren't some all-time greats to reflect on. Now, as per usual, this is my list, so it'll reflect my tastes and the stuff that I had a chance to play. Similarly, my rules regarding premium games with microtransactions and remasters of older games apply, which is to say, neither of those things will be appearing here. There's a good chance that the 15 games I'm about to talk about, that's 9 Game of the Year runners-up, 5 special mentions, and 1 Game of the Year, are going to vary wildly from your own Game of the Year picks, so as always, I'd love to hear about the games that you loved this past year in the comments below. So without further ado, I'm Josh the Top Hat Gamer, and these are my top 10 games of 2021, plus some special mentions. 2021's best game that made me back down? Returnal. If you know me, then you know that I'm no stranger to knuckling down and finishing tough as nails games for a review, but without that strict weekly deadline, it turns out that my willingness to bash my head into a wall suffers somewhat. To that end, Returnal is easily one of the most tense and difficult gameplay experiences of 2021, so much so that I didn't actually beat it. But that's hardly the game's fault, beyond it just being pretty goddamn hard, I mean. With tight, responsive controls, a small variety of supremely satisfying weapons, and aggressive enemies that bombard you with a mesmerizing bullet hell onslaught, Returnal's action consistently put me in a state of flow that few other games can achieve. Hell, even design choices like mapping your weapon's secondary fire to the DualSense controller's adaptive triggers, something that seemed finicky and unreliable in theory, ended up working like a dream. If I died in a run, it's typically because I messed up. Unless I was just having an unlucky run, which is kind of par for the roguelike course. I can't say I was super in love with the roguelike elements like the procedurally generated maps and items, but that's a matter of personal taste more than anything. And honestly, even though I'm not a fan of procedurally generated run-based games, Returnal does a lot with the concept that I really appreciated. Mechanics like suit malfunctions, which have a chance of occurring when you open certain chests, or parasites which assign a random buff and a random nerf to your character, prodded at the gambler inside me, tempting me to push my luck on runs where I was dominating the game and allowing me to throw caution to the wind on runs that I'd already deemed failures. It also helps that the game is quite the looker. Running on the PS5, Returnal's graphics are sharp, its performance is as smooth as butter, and the art style is dark and foreboding, but with plenty of variety, making this already stressful game that much more tense. I have zero shame in admitting that Returnal was a bit much for me to handle this year, but in reflecting on it for this video, I think I want to dive in again. I may not gain any progress, but I'll certainly have some pulse-pounding fun, and honestly, that might be enough. Number 10. Metroid Dread. It's wild to think that it had been 4 years since Metroid Prime 4 was announced, 4 years since the last side-scrolling Metroid game released on handheld, and 11 years since the franchise's last release on console when Nintendo announced, and released within a few months, Metroid Dread. Now, the quality of a new Metroid game shouldn't be nearly as surprising, but it kind of is when you consider that the last console release was over a decade ago and was also Metroid Other M. So, when Metroid Dread raced its way from announcement to release in only 4 months and turned out to not only be good but genuinely pretty fantastic, it was honestly kind of shocking. Now, Metroid Dread doesn't bring a ton of new ideas to the table, but it does hone the elements that the franchise has become synonymous with over its 33 years of existence. From its twisting, interconnected maps that subtly funnel you forward and keep you from getting lost, to the slow drip of new abilities that take you from being a lost weakling on an alien world to a killing machine with mastery over the environment, Metroid Dread is exploration platforming at its no-frills finest. And while Metroid Dread relies heavily on extremely well-executed basics, it does offer one new idea in particular, the game's Emmy Zones. Named for the nearly unstoppable enemies that occupy them, Metroid Dread's Emmy Zones pit Samus against robotic predators that hunt her relentlessly, tracking her, matching her traversal skills, and bringing almost unavoidable death should they catch her. These anxiety-inducing sequences are a fantastic change of pace to the probing tempo of most Metroidvania games, and the fatal capabilities of the Emmys makes Metroid Dread's subtitle feel particularly apt, at least for a while before the Emmys' unforgiving window for counterattacks inspire more frustration than fear, and the overabundant checkpoints neutralize any real sense of danger from the encounters. Still, there's plenty to love about Metroid Dread, from its perfection of the Metroidvania formula to its thrilling boss fights, which range from massive screen-filling affairs to smaller, faster, more evenly matched encounters. Honestly, this might even be the best Metroid story told in a game. It pays off on established threads from previous games, introduces new elements and surprising twists, and culminates in one hell of a finale. Obviously, this is a must-play for Metroid fans, but it might also be my new favorite game on the Switch. Number 9. Unpacking. You know what I hate more than almost anything in life? Moving houses. Packing an entire life into a series of heavy boxes and awkwardly ferrying them from one place to another just to unpack them all on the other side? No thanks. Well, maybe not the unpacking part, as it turns out. There's something incredibly soothing about opening up boxes and unloading their contents onto shelves and into cupboards, finding a space for everything and making sure that everything is in their correct space. Or at least, there is when it's a game you're playing and not backbreaking physical labor. And I know what you're probably thinking. How fun could a game about unpacking boxes really be? But truthfully, there really is a great deal of satisfaction to be gained from organizing and rearranging objects in a series of empty rooms across 8 different levels. And while the relaxing quality of unpacking is enhanced by the colorful, charming pixel art style and lovely acoustic guitar-heavy soundtrack, it does offer something more than mere organizational satisfaction. It also offers a story. Now, environmental storytelling is nothing new in the world of video games, but it's so rare to find a case where the game's entire story is told through the environment, but Unpacking kind of is its environment. Across its 8 levels, the game follows one person from home to home throughout their life. It begins with you unpacking their room as a child in 1997 with toys, books, and stationery, and as you progress you get a surprisingly good sense of just who this person you're following is. You see their growing interest in tabletop RPGs and their attachment to certain belongings. You'll see the first time they live with other people, and the first time they move in with a significant other. It's kind of fascinating just how much you learn about this character over the course of the game, and even more amazing is just how attached I became to this person that I'd never even seen or heard. Unpacking has so many wonderful things going for it, with its satisfying core gameplay and tranquil vibe, and it's clear that its creation was a labor of love. I mean, what else would you call recording 14,000 plus Foley effects for a game simply for picking up and placing items on different surfaces? (2021's best value for money), Lost Judgment. When I throw these Game of the Year lists together, I rarely take a game's length or price into account. Great games can cost $100 or be free. They can take weeks to complete or a single afternoon. But this year I thought it might be worthwhile to single out a game that I enjoyed immensely and over a decent amount of time: Lost Judgment. As a sequel to a Yakuza spin-off, Lost Judgment is jam-packed full of button-mashing brawler action that, despite its simplicity, never really gets old. The first time you beat the absolute hell out of a bunch of street thugs may not differ that greatly from the last time you do it in a mechanical sense, but it remains entertaining for the game's duration thanks to an ever-growing list of combos, skills, and insanely over-the-top EX maneuvers. But like its predecessor and the Yakuza games that spawned it, Lost Judgment isn't just endless street fights from start to finish. Much like the games that came before, it features a metric buttload of minigames to keep you occupied, from batting cages and darts to new additions like boxing and motorcycle death races. And no, I did not misspeak. Lost Judgment also features some of the most wildly varied writing in video games. Its side content, for example, is full of wild hijinks and surreal humor, while the main story is this incredibly serious drama about justice and vengeance, and the virtues and failures of the legal process. It would be jarring in any other game, but Lost Judgment pulls it all off so well. At a glance, Lost Judgment may simply sound like another one of those when viewed alongside the Yakuza games, and to an extent it kind of is, but it might just be the best of those. Lost Judgment has the most compelling story that I've seen in one of these games, and though it may not be a great detective game in a mechanical sense, the narrative of Lost Judgment does have the pacing and flow of a great mystery story, where all the pieces are available to you and begin falling into place just as the characters are reaching a revelation. Now imagine all of that spread across 50 hours of gameplay, at least, and you'll understand why I think Lost Judgment is the best value for money from this past year. Number 8. Death's Door. Sometimes all it takes for a game to grab my attention is a distinctive art direction, and Death's Door, with its subtle colour palette, adorable character designs and diorama-esque perspective, certainly had that. What I wasn't expecting, however, was for Death's Door to back that charming style up with anything out of the ordinary. I often find that isometric hack and slash affairs come up short in terms of impact, but Death's Door packs a surprising punch in that department. The snappy controls, the bright visual flair accompanying your attacks, and a generous helping of hit stop when those attacks connect all contribute to a combat system that, while never really gaining any complexity, remains gratifying from start to finish. And although the hack and slash mechanics never evolved beyond your light combo, charged heavy and dodging heavy attacks, there is some variety to be had with the inclusion of multiple weapons and magical attacks. Outside of combat, the game offers looping level design reminiscent of Dark Souls, full of dangers and shortcuts between limited checkpoints, as well as simple but effective environmental puzzles to break up the game's pace a bit. But for as well put together as Death's Door's gameplay is, it's not the thing that secured it a place on this list. Even the game's presentation, with its adorable visuals and delightfully smooth soundtrack, isn't what kept it here. No, the part of Death's Door that I was most taken with was its writing. Putting players in the role of a Reaper, Death's Door unsurprisingly features death quite prominently. You're tasked with collecting the souls of beings who have staved off death for an unnaturally long time, and the game actually humanizes these antagonists in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before. Not all of its antagonists are necessarily good people, or even people, but it's hard not to relate to at least a couple of them on some level. After all, the fear of death isn't exactly uncommon, and when the game actively holds funerals for them after their defeat, it's honestly kind of difficult to view them as complete monsters. But it's not just Death's Door's mature themes and how it handles them that stuck with me. It's the way that it contrasts the grim subject matter with charming characters, silly jokes, and a sense of playfulness. The game certainly treats death with the utmost importance. I mean, just look at how it treats your death. But it also makes sure to celebrate the life that happens along the way as well. Number 7. Resident Evil 8 Village. There are a few franchises that have seen as many ups and downs as the Resident Evil series, but being around for 25 years, that makes sense. A series doesn't survive that long without changing, and you don't make changes without risking missteps along the way. But recent games indicate that the franchise is on the upswing, with one excellent remake and a shockingly good new entry in the form of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. With those games fresh in my memory, I wasn't sure that Capcom could top them, but Resident Evil 8 Village may just be my perfect Resident Evil. On the surface, Resident Evil 8 takes a lot of cues from the series' highest points. It utilizes labyrinthine maps and lock and key puzzles that RE1 and 2 originated, and their remakes and RE7 polished to a mirror shine. It amps up the shock and sheer terror that helped Resident Evil 7 make such an impact. Hell, it even manages to sneak in some of the over-the-top camp and outlandish weirdness of Resident Evil 4 into the mix. But the game is more than just the things that made the other Resident Evil games great rolled into one big ball. It's also a fresh take on a style of horror that the Resi franchise just hasn't really touched before. At their core, each RE game is ultimately viral horror, but where the classics were content with the trappings of zombie horror and Resident Evil 7 straight into hillbilly and serial killer horror, Village takes that one step further by going full-on gothic. It introduces terrors ripped straight from gothic literature, like vampires, werewolves, and Frankenstein's monster. Its tense adventure is set in a strange and foreign environment that, in true RE fashion, becomes a character in and of itself, and it unfurls a story that dangles more mysteries in front of players from its outset than most Resident Evil games do for their entire duration. When I ask an RE fan what their favourite game in the franchise is, the answer is usually one of a handful of constants. They say the first 2 games for their establishment and refinement of the series' core elements. They say 4 because it's weird and wild. They say 7 because it's terrifying and gripping. But while I can appreciate these answers, I think my answer from now on will have to be RE Village. Not because it excels at any one thing that it borrows from the high points of the franchise, but because it applies them all to a style of horror that speaks to me, personally. It's as simple as that.
Let's see what you're doing. Ethan Winters. Get ready. No!
2021's best soundtrack, Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. When Eidos Montreal announced that they were working on a Guardians of the Galaxy video game, the reaction of pretty much everyone was a resounding, meh. Marvel's Avengers, a game that I didn't entirely hate, still sat in the forefront of people's minds as this broken, disappointing mess of a game, and early showings of this Guardians game weren't instilling much hope. Like the Avengers game, this was a wholly original rendition of the titular heroes, and everything that was shown just felt off. But even in those early days after the reveal, one thing seemed certain. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy was probably going to have a killer soundtrack. Now, say what you will regarding how the game actually turned out. I personally thought it was a fantastic story told through some brilliant performances, but was held back by some of the most boring combat I could imagine. But that soundtrack turned out pretty goddamn well. If you're a fan of the classic rock vibes of the MCU Guardians of the Galaxy, then there's a lot to love here, even if it is a little more mainstream than you'd find in the movies. I feel like I could just list the artists and songs featured in the game and call it a day, because there are some absolute bangers in there, like Blue Oyster Cult's Don't Fear the Reaper, Flock of Seagulls' I Ran, and of course, Bonnie Tyler's Holding Out for a Hero. But there's one particular addition to the game's soundtrack that really tips it over the edge for me. The absolute last thing I expected from Eidos Montreal was for their senior audio director to literally form an 80s style rock band called Star-Lord and produce an actual real album that the in-game character of Star-Lord would listen to and take inspiration from. For that album to kick ass as well is just the icing on the cake. So yeah, you should probably consider playing Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Not because it's a compelling gameplay experience, because it's not. And not because it's an excellent story, even though it is. But because the madmen at Eidos Montreal actually went out and made a rock band and a full album by said band just for this game. Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy is ultimately good, but Star-Lord is excellent.
Let's take a stand right in this moment, stare in the eyes of our opponents, and fight until only one of us remains. Who's with me?
Yes!
Number 6. Psychonauts 2. The original Psychonauts, released 16 years ago, was a delightfully weird and witty game about a kid who runs away from the circus to join a psychic summer camp, and on the strength of that premise and its inherent comedy, it became a cult classic. Or at least I assume it was that, because when I revisited it for the first time in over a decade, they were the things that I left feeling really good about. Unlike the platforming. Replaying that original game, even with its shortcomings, did manage to get me excited about a modern sequel though. All that charm and wit, but with some decent gameplay behind it? Sign me up. But what I got was so much more. Psychonauts 2 doesn't just fine-tune the okay at best platforming of the original. It also adds a ton of heart to the charm and wit of the original, while also looking damn good in the process. So let's cover the simple parts first. Psychonauts 2 is a dramatic improvement in terms of gameplay. 3D platforming is still something that some games can't quite nail, but Psychonauts 2 feels almost effortlessly smooth to control. I'm sure countless hours of work went into making it feel as responsive as it does, but going from Psychonauts to its sequel, it really is night and day. Similarly, the sequel's visuals are simply gorgeous, especially in contrast to the first game's muddy, pre-rendered cutscenes and angular in-engine graphics. There's something truly breathtaking about a game with a bold art style being brought to life with powerful tech behind it, and Psychonauts 2 is a shining example of this. Now for the more complicated part. Psychonauts 2 at a glance is a silly, kid-friendly game about psychic spies and plots to destroy the world, but to leave it at that would be doing it a disservice. It's also a game that deals with a broad array of mental health related themes, and it does so in a surprisingly mature manner. Psychonauts 2 presents a cast of characters who are each dealing with their own issues, presenting them not as flawed or as lesser, but as people. People who need someone to understand and care. Now, the game doesn't lose its weird sense of humour. An absolute highlight of the game involves a cooking contest hosted by puppets, for crying out loud, but it never makes these characters or their mental health the butt of the joke. Instead, it gives you some insight into what makes them tick, albeit highly stylized, fantastical insight, and asks you to be the one to understand and care. And the world of games could use more of that.
Oh, I guess I'm escaping then. Bye! Please don't tell. You know I'm a reformed man. You were there. You saw me. Plus, I need to get back to camp. I left my kid there. Wait, what?
Number 5. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. When I think about the past year in gaming, I inevitably think about the latest generation of consoles. After all, 90% of the games I've played this year have been on the PS5 or the Xbox Series X, and I'm constantly in awe of the power of these machines. But that power only counts for anything if you've got great games to use it on, and I can think of no better example than Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. At its core, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is the same game it's always been. It's full of responsive platforming, chaotic shootouts, weird and wonderful worlds and equally insane weapons, and these elements have never been executed better. Similarly, the game offers a touching story full of memorable characters, much like many of its predecessors. At a base level, Rift Apart is pure refined Ratchet & Clank, but man, that PS5 tech really lets it shine. There's no area of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart that I can think of that doesn't feel improved by the fact that it's running on more powerful hardware. The weird and wonderful planets found in the series have never looked so vibrant and alive thanks to the impressive lighting and visual fidelity, and the ability to utilize ray tracing while still running at a silky smooth 60 FPS means that the futuristic setting achieves a cohesive look without sacrificing responsive gameplay. On that note, I can't recall a Ratchet & Clank title that feels as good to play as this does, and that's not just down to the game's performance. The gorgeous visuals help the game's wacky sci-fi carnage to feel impactful and satisfying, yes, but it's actually the PS5's DualSense controllers that really elevate things here. Not only does the DualSense's haptic feedback allow certain guns to feel subtly different, but the adaptive triggers further deepen the bizarre character of the game's diverse armory, giving certain weapons different functions based on how the trigger is pulled. This is usually achieved by mapping an alternate fire option or secondary function to a half pull of the trigger, which works way better than you'd expect, I might add. And then there's the PS5's SSD that practically turns load times between levels into a thing of the past, allowing the game to pull off jaw-dropping moments where you shift from world to world in the middle of gameplay with nary a hitch. With the insane tech fueling Insomniac's top-notch game design, it's no wonder that Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart has been a highlight of the current generation of consoles and of 2021.
Print instruction manuals anymore?
2021's best surprise, Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon. Since Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon had been in development for some time and wasn't really being kept secret, it might seem strange to call it my favourite surprise of the year, but I have my reasons. The first is that I completely forgot that it was a thing, but that's not the only reason. In fact, I only forgot about its existence because I'm just not a fan of tile-matching puzzle games. Tetris, Puyo Puyo, and their respective knockoffs just don't do anything for me, so when I heard that the new Shovel Knight spin-off would be one of them, I just stopped paying attention to it. But then the release date came and caught me off guard by showing up on the Switch newsfeed, and I bought it before I could even think, wait, will I even enjoy this? The real surprise, however, came when I started the game and I liked it. Like, a lot. Now, thanks to its mid-December release date, I didn't get to pour a huge amount of time into Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon before Game of the Year time rolled around, but I feel like it's gotta be doing something right if it can get me, Mr. I don't like tile matching games, to have fun with it. In fact, the first thing I plan on doing once this video is up will be to sink more hours into it. Maybe it's Pocket Dungeon's absolutely killer remix of the Shovel Knight soundtrack combined with the game's fun take on the established designs from the original game that won me over. Maybe it's the fun hit-trading combat gimmick that it brings to the tile-matching subgenre, giving the usual puzzle game fare a surprising layer of strategy. The less interesting answer here, but probably the correct one, is that it's all of it combined. Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon takes the already substantial charm of the original game and twists it with a fresh style, while retaining a lot of what makes Shovel Knight as a franchise great. Memorable levels, entertaining bosses, hell, the game even mimics the original Shovel Knight's later content by including multiple playable characters. Shovel Knight Pocket Dungeon is everything I've loved about Shovel Knight over the years, but in a new and unexpected package that I shouldn't like, but I actually kind of adore. Number 4. Hitman 3. I've said before that sometimes a game doesn't need to reinvent the wheel to become a Game of the Year contender. Refining what makes a game great in the sequel can be enough, for sure, but what really gets me excited is when a game takes what its predecessor did and applies it in new and intriguing ways. Hitman 3 is a prime example of this. If you've played Hitman 2016 or its sequel, then you probably have a good grasp on what to expect from Hitman 3. Sprawling levels filled with a multitude of winding paths and points of ingress, inventive methods of murder that feel rewarding to discover and satisfying to pull off, and malleable stealth mechanics that provide just enough opposition while still being somewhat forgiving. Wrap all of that up with a reward system that encourages experimentation and replayability, and you have the entirety of the World of Assassination trilogy in a nutshell. Hitman 3 does everything that the previous games did, and it does them really well. Does it do them tangibly better than either Hitman 2016 or Hitman 2? No, not really. But it's the game's application of that excellent design to some of the most unique and engaging situations in the franchise that truly sets Hitman 3 apart. One mission has you infiltrating the scene of a murder, giving you the opportunity to use the elements of an unfolding whodunit to your advantage, while another turns the tables on Agent 47, placing a small squad of assassins in and around an underground rave to take you out, making you the hunter and the hunted all at once. That second example in particular has become one of my favourite Hitman scenarios ever, as it forces you to not only evade detection by your pursuers, but also tasks you with deducing who your targets are before beating them to the punch. It's tense and fun, and it forces you to actually think, and it's Hitman at its finest. Now, the application of the already fine-tuned gameplay to new and exciting scenarios isn't the only thing to gush about here. Hitman 3 looks incredible, especially in the flashier levels like Chongqing and Dubai in all their shiny reflective glory, and it continues to be absolutely hilarious. Plus, the game wraps up the trilogy's intriguing story in a satisfying package. The game even uses the DualSense controller's adaptive triggers in a way that makes firearms kind of tempting for the first time ever. Like, I never want to go into a Hitman game and shoot people, but these triggers actually feel kinda cool. So I wanted to shoot people in Hitman. It's wild. But ultimately, it is Hitman 3's fresh execution of tried and true mechanics that makes it a real killer.
This is my ancestral burial ground. Simple and clean is how we've always gone about it, and how it will be this time as well. And the flower.
Number 3. Inscryption. Deck builders are not my kind of game. I enjoy them well enough on a mechanical level, and I'm a sucker for striking card art, but so often I find myself losing interest in them long before I finish them. As it turns out, all a deck builder needs to get me hooked is a deeply unsettling tone. Or at least that's what Inscryption hits you with out of the gate, and it certainly piqued my interest. You find yourself sitting at a table across from a pair of glowing, occasionally spinning eyes that peer out of the impenetrable darkness. Even though you've continued a mysterious in-progress save file, the creature opposite you recognizes that you're new, offering rules and guidance on how to play this obscure card game, complete with thinly veiled threats and foreboding turns of phrase. The game itself is pretty straightforward. You have animal cards with a health score and an attack score, as well as a summoning cost that dictates how many currently in-play cards you have to sacrifice for you to place it on the table. Animals attack at the end of each turn, and if there isn't an animal in the opposing lane, then the damage a card inflicts is taken directly by the player. After dealing enough damage to tip the table's ever-present scales towards your opponent, you win. If the scales tip toward your end, you lose, and things get weird. But I think that's something that you folks are going to have to find out for yourselves. As well as I think Inscryption would hold up even with its biggest surprises and secrets ruined, I also think that they're best experienced firsthand. If you're going into Inscryption expecting a simple roguelike deck builder, then you're likely to be caught off guard at every turn. Inscryption might start as one thing, but even in its early hours it starts introducing elements like spooky escape room style puzzles to keep you off balance, while it gradually introduces story elements that will keep you asking yourself, what the fuck is this game, as you stare into your monitor with dead eyes at 3 AM on a Tuesday. All I can safely say about Inscryption is that as a deck builder, it offers plenty of satisfying synergies to discover while collecting cards, and some really interesting and tense twists on the core card game, even before things start to get truly out of hand. And once things do get out of hand, well, no other deck builder has had me as utterly enthralled as this did, because no other deck builder is doing anything like Inscryption. "2021's best multiplayer, It Takes Two." 2021 was no stranger to great multiplayer experiences, at least that's what my friend Aaron over at Total Badness says. But while he's been spending all his time in Knockout City, Halo Infinite, and Splitgate, all worthy games to be sure, I've long since lost my taste for competitive multiplayer. No, for me, the best multiplayer games of the year were ones that put couch co-op front and center, giving me a chance to play with my girlfriend. Games like Kiwi, and the game that gave me the best multiplayer experience of the year, It Takes Two. 3 years ago, Hazelight Studios released A Way Out, a game that brought co-op to the forefront with a story that could only be experienced with 2 players, all while offering divergent paths and asymmetrical mechanics so that this 2-player journey didn't just feel like it could have been a single-player game with an optional co-op buddy. It had some rough edges, but it also had a lot of charm, and it gave me that golden opportunity to play alongside my girlfriend. It Takes Two is their second attempt at the exclusively co-op narrative game, and for my money, I think Hazelight have really nailed their formula here. Ditching the more grounded action of Way Out for a more stylized, cartoony platformer, It Takes Two allows for a wider array of varied mechanics to share between players. You still have vehicle sections where one player drives and the other takes control of a weapon to defend the team, but during the game's main sequences, you're given unique abilities that impact the core platforming. One section might have one player throwing nails into walls so that the other player with a hammer can swing off of them, while another might give one player the ability to walk on ceilings and one the ability to change size, opening up entirely different routes for each player. In addition to being a co-op dream, It Takes Two has a really compelling story that stands out among video games, cause seriously, how often do games talk about divorce and family troubles? And it brings this tiny world of living toys, intelligent appliances, and warring critters to life with an undeniably charming style. In lieu of a new Titanfall game, It Takes Two is exactly what I want from a multiplayer title. Though I would take another Titanfall. Number 2. Disco Elysium: The Final Cut. It's rare that I can look back at a game and pinpoint the exact moment I fell in love with it, but with Disco Elysium: The Final Cut, it's as clear as day. While attempting to slip out of the hostel to avoid paying my bill, I failed a savoir-faire roll, causing my character to sprint towards the front door before leaping and turning in midair to flip the double bird at the hostel manager. As he hung in the air, arms extended, middle fingers proudly on display, the game brought my attention to the old lady sat in a wheelchair directly behind him. Things went about as you might expect from there, and I was left absolutely dumbstruck by the train wreck in motion that is Disco Elysium's protagonist. Without a doubt, the soaring highs and crushing lows brought about by your actions are easily my favourite part of Disco Elysium, a game that captures the unpredictable nature of tabletop RPGs better than almost any other I can think of. Like any video game, it can't account for every outcome in the same way a Flesh and Blood Game Master can, but Disco Elysium does take a surprising amount of your choices into account, opening up new dialogue options and unintended consequences during moments that often seem completely disconnected. Also, it's worth noting that Disco Elysium is a rare game that actually makes playing through your mistakes fun and interesting. A lot of gamers are unhealthily attached to the practice of save scumming, but it's honestly kind of hard to want to succeed at everything when you play such a spectacular mess, and when the failures are as fucking hilarious as they are. But beyond the refreshing combat-averse approach to the RPG genre, Disco Elysium has plenty to offer. Its story is both a fascinating murder mystery and a journey of self-discovery, where each aspect of your character's personality has its own voice and opinion on your choices. The writing is both exceptionally funny and downright depressing at times, while exploring broad political and intensely personal themes at the same time. All of this is brought to life with a gorgeous watercolor art style, and the final cut in particular is packed full of excellent voice work from top to bottom. The only things keeping Disco Elysium: The Final Cut from being my undisputed game of the year this year were a handful of bugs that plagued its release, and the fact that the game originally came out in 2019. But Disco Elysium: The Final Cut is brilliant work that's deserving of more praise than I can deliver, and the fact that it's widely available on most platforms now is absolutely worth celebrating.
The wounds from the war you waged on your body are healing, twist by twist, turn by turn. You have become a flawless interlocking mechanism.
Number 1. Deathloop. From its earliest showings, I've been enamored with Deathloop. With a strong 60s inspired style, a Groundhog Day-esque premise, and Arkane's signature approach to small-scale open worlds that encourage freedom and experimentation, of course I had high expectations for it. Thankfully, Deathloop not only delivered on those expectations, it surpassed them all. The visual flair that it burst onto the scene with at E3 2019 permeates Deathloop's world, filling it with weird and colourful art installations and party fixtures, as well as vibrant and chaotic characters, and although it shares a similar graphical quality to Arkane's previous work, there's a spark to Deathloop's visuals that wasn't present in either Prey or Dishonored. Likewise, Deathloop offers gameplay that's similar to what Arkane is known for, while also being distinct. The mechanics allow for sneaky stealth runs or all-out guns-blazing action, with a decent variety of weapons and abilities to facilitate either approach, and while this isn't too dissimilar from, say, Dishonored, I feel like Deathloop is less restrictive in practice. I mean, you could play Dishonored as a rampaging killer, but the game always seemed to disapprove of certain playstyles. Deathloop, meanwhile, encourages chaotic gunfights, stealthy assassinations, and everything in between, and the implementation of a time loop into this tried-and-true formula only encourages experimentation and variety further. On that note, the time loop makes for a fascinating mechanic and an intriguing plot point. In terms of gameplay, it gives Deathloop's small offering of stages plenty of depth, as you can visit each of them during different periods of the day with different results. Meanwhile, on the narrative front, the concept naturally invites questions. Why is time looping, and who are the visionaries you have to kill to stop it? Do you even want to stop it? While the search for answers and the moment everything falls together are extremely satisfying, it isn't all that Deathloop has to offer. The game also lets you invade other players' games to hunt them down and stop them from breaking the loop in a Dark Souls style multiplayer mode. While I was definitely here for the main story, this multiplayer offering is just fantastic. Letting players control the in-narrative rival character is a stroke of brilliance, and on the flip side, being hunted by a human player is tense and thrilling. If Deathloop was just the brilliant mix of stealth and action and intricate level design that I expect from Arcane, it would have probably made this list. But by bringing it to life with such flair, by prompting so many questions, by implementing an exciting multiplayer element, and by miraculously making their gameplay formula more conducive to experimentation and curiosity, it's no wonder Deathloop is my game of the year for 2021. No joke, I could play it over and over and over again.
You wrote it on the Black Reef postcard. You understand? Okay. I'm gonna drop you now. Wait, no, wait! No!
So there you have it, that was my top 10 games of 2021. How do you think I did? Did you play the games I listed, and if so, did you enjoy them? If not, what games would you consider to be the best of 2021? Please let me know in the comments below. I always love hearing about the games that exemplified the year for other people, and it would be boring if we all just played and loved the same things. As for this channel in 2022, well, I guess we'll see. My professional situation continues to keep me busy and tired, so I can't really promise anything, but I would like to make a return to YouTube and Twitch in some capacity. Like I said, we'll see. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope 2022 delivers some fantastic gaming experiences and, more importantly, treats you all well. Good luck out there.